Good morning, everyone, from the Fortress of Solitude during this minor crisis we've got going on here. I say minor. It's not the Spanish influenza yet. We'll see what ends up happening. Speaking of which, we're going to mention the Spanish influenza a little bit later on. So we're going to continue on with World War One, and so we're going to call this World War One Part Two. Although usually I refer to World War Two as World War One Part Two, the sequel. So with that said, let's get going. It wouldn't be much of a world war if it was only fought there in eastern France and Belgium. So we're going to look outside the Western Front is where we're going to start today. All right, so let's start with talking about the Eastern Front in Europe, and this is going to be fought over basically where Poland, if you have an idea of where Poland is, uh, Poland and Russia on the western edge of Russia, the eastern edge of Germany and Poland, and all through there. Excuse me. In 1914, the Russians actually attack first. They get together and they have not fully mobilized. And this is a big mistake for them because without fully mobilizing, they don't have the huge numbers of troops that they're going to need to overwhelm the Germans. The Germans are ready for them. The Germans have been preparing for a Russian invasion for years. They have plans for doing it. And the Russians are defeated pretty soundly at a place called Tannenberg, the Battle of Tannenberg, by a man named Paul von Hindenburg. He becomes very influential in Germany between World War I and World War II. He'll actually be the president of Germany at that time, during an era they called the Weimar Republic. Beaten so badly, the Russians will retreat to Russia. They get followed up, essentially, a few months later by the Germans and the Austrians in what they call the Great Offensive of 1915, which pushes the Russians all the way out of Poland and Lithuania, which used to be part of Russia. The Russians will lose 1 million men in that offensive, and that's still mostly wounded, but a lot of that is dead because the Russians and the Germans, when they fight, it gets really ugly, and the Russians honestly simply didn't have enough doctors and medical staff to do a very good job of treating their wounded. In 1916, the war continues. Russia keeps fighting. Part of the problem is that the Tsar himself has decided that he's going to lead the Russian troops. Now, he's not personally fighting in the battles, but he's gone to the front and he's personally giving the orders. And unfortunately for Russia, he's just not real good at it. Whereas Paul von Hindenburg and his assistant guy by the name of Falkenhayn are very, very good at it. And so Russia will continue to lose battle after battle. Another big problem that the Russians have is that their officers all come from the nobility, and the troops all come from the peasants and the urban factory workers and things. They have little respect or liking for one another. The nobles don't like each other very much. There's a lot of old standing rivalries between them. Some of the generals will refuse to go to the aid of other generals when they need it in battles against the Germans and the Austrians. The troops don't trust their leadership. It's just bad, and the troops aren't very well trained. It's not that they didn't care, at least at first. They were very enthusiastic about protecting Mother Russia, the Rodina, as they call it. But they just aren't well trained. They're not well equipped. And they're very poorly led. They're just outclassed, is all there is to it. And by 1917, they've gotten sick to death of this, and literally. And so they revolt. And they turn around and start walking home. Murdering their own officers in some cases in order to do so. There's a political revolution going on back in Russia. between the Bolsheviks and other groups who were trying to overthrow the Tsar, and managed to do so, partly with the help of some of these returning soldiers who have just they're fed up with the system that was feeding them into a meat grinder. And so they helped to overthrow the Tsar. And we'll talk more about a little bit about Lenin and the Bolsheviks taking over. They don't really become important until after World War II as far as U.S. history is concerned. In 1918, the new Russian government will sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and withdraws from the war, ending the war pretty much on the Eastern Front. Since this is a worldwide war, we're not talking about just Europe either. So over in Asia, what's going on? Well, in this war, Japan is on the Allied side. They side with the British and the Americans. Mainly they do that because there's a bunch of German territory over in Eastern Asia. Parts of China are controlled by the Germans. Several island chains in the Pacific are controlled by the Germans. And the Japanese figure, well, while Germany's preoccupied fighting the Allies, we'll just snatch these up. And that's exactly what they do. And at the peace treaty, eventually they'll get to keep those things. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers. That's the Germans, the Austrians, the Bulgarians, and the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Turks from Turkey will join the Central Powers. For a large part of it, it's not the largest part of the war. That's definitely the Western Front and the Eastern Front, but it's a big part. And the Arab nationalists decide to rise up against the Ottoman Turks. They've done it before unsuccessfully. This time they get a little help from the British. A fairly famous fellow by the name of Thomas Edward Lawrence goes and is the liaison between the British and the Arab leaders, the Arab king, King Fahd, and they take over. And so he becomes known as, he goes native is the term. He begins to dress like them, and like Arabs, and he really starts to sort of enjoy living a life like that. He will eventually go back to England, and the British will eventually betray the Arabs. But he gets known as Lawrence of Arabia. The British will attempt to invade Turkey at a place called Gallipoli, and largely using Australian and New Zealand troopers, which were called the ANZACs, A-N-Z-A-C, the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps. And that's where a lot of Australians and New Zealanders fought, was there at Gallipoli. They don't do well. It's pretty much a dismal failure down there. It is the brainchild of one Winston Churchill to have tried that, and it hurts him politically. He's already into politics at this point. Again, he'll show up very prominently when we talk about World War II. India will send 1.3 million troops to help Britain on the Western Front. India was a British colony still, and they send a lot of soldiers to help fight on the Western Front in Africa and against the Ottomans. They didn't do real well on the Western Front. The climate was so different that many of them got very ill and suffered pretty badly from that. But they were good troops. Not that they were bad troops, just the climate change was a little severe for them. Here we have a period photograph of a group of soldiers from India. These are men known as Sikhs. It's a religious group that's from India. Very interesting people, very warlike. They'd been persecuted for a very long time, and so they very into self-defense and things like that. So here they are dressed as British troops because they were fighting with the British for the British, and marching through London in a parade. And here's a English lady going over and giving a flower to one of the Sikh officers. Just sort of an interesting little thing. All right, finishing up discussion of the war around the world in Africa and Oceania. Oceania being, of course, all the Pacific Islands and Australia and all like that. In Africa, British troops from their colonies, including South Africa, which was a British colony, pretty quickly seized German colonies in Africa. There is one particular fellow, German leader by the name of von Lettern, who leads a very long resistance against the British. But for the most part, the British, von Lettow, he does a pretty good job, but everybody else pretty much collapses to the British. And they use troops from South Africa to do that. Interestingly, some of the South Africans actually supported the Germans. They wanted the Germans to win the war. And the reason for that is that the South Africans had only very recently become part of the British Empire really fully. The British had fought against the local Dutch colonists known as Boers, and they'd had two Boer wars, and the last one had only ended about 15 years before World War I began. And a lot of those Boers who weren't British, they were ethnically Dutch and had lived in Africa for centuries, their families, they weren't real happy with British rule and didn't want it. And they hoped that the Germans would win and that they could get their independence from Britain again. And then the Australians and New Zealanders, the Kiwis, I mentioned earlier, they volunteered to go and help Britain during the time of war as part of the Commonwealth. Canada also sent a large number of soldiers. In fact, one of their pilots is the man credited with shooting down the famous Red Baron. One of the reasons for the massive casualty counts you're going to see in World War I is that it was a new kind of war that really nobody had ever fought before. This is the first truly 100% modern war between two modern, well-armed, well-funded, large major nations. And so that's going to make a different kind of warfare than these people were used to. Most of the British and German troops and officers that had combat experience had gained that in combat against colonial opponents who typically were few in number, not terribly well organized, not terribly well equipped, and not terribly well trained, although they may have individually been excellent fighters. As a whole, they were simply outclassed by the organization, equipment, training, etc. of the European nations. Now, this is European nations taking all of that and throwing it against each other and finding out that what worked against a bunch of guys in the Sudan, for example, is simply not going to work on the Western Front when you're facing machine guns. One thing that is going to make this war different from previous wars is that it is a truly honest, total war effort for these nations. Everybody and everything is going to be channeled into the war effort. And that's not real common prior to this era. That's what total war means. It means all out. Everybody pushing and pulling to do their best for the war effort, from obviously the men on the front, but also women at home wrapping bandages, children going around and collecting garbage for recycling purposes to turn into weapons. And you'll see a lot of that on the American front, for example, during World War II. World War I is not a total war for the Americans, but it is for most of Europe. This has a huge economic impact. Excuse me. Both sides are set up systems to recruit, arm, train millions of soldiers, huge fighting forces. All of them already had, prior to the war, national conscription laws. That means every able-bodied man in the country at some point or another had served, at least briefly for a year or two usually, in the military and had their basic training, had been assigned to a unit. It's like the whole country is in the reserves or in the National Guard. The only exception to that is the British. The British will institute conscription during the war, where they start drafting people whether they want to fight or not. But at the start of the war, they've got so many volunteers. They've got so many volunteers that they literally can't train them all. They actually have to turn volunteers away with a letter saying, "We'll be in touch." Governments are going to raise taxes. They got to borrow huge amounts of money, much of it from the United States, especially on the Allied side. They begin to ration food and other products necessary for the war effort, rubber and metals and all of that sort of thing that are used to make the machineries of war. Gasoline was another majorly rationed item. They get to help drive this effort at home. They institute a lot of propaganda, and we'll look at a few propaganda type posters here. Both sides did it. Propaganda is basically the idea of you use ideas to promote your cause or to damage an opposing cause. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. It's almost always emotional. For example, this poster here, where it's an after the war kind of thing, and the little girl sitting on her daddy's lap says, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" And he's looking off like, "How am I going to explain this to my daughter?" Obviously hinting that if you didn't fight, if you didn't join the military in Britain's time of need, and this is a British ad, then you should be ashamed of yourself. And it's very subtle, like most political cartoons. Propaganda is usually just about that subtle. And here you can see a few more examples of that propaganda. The first two are enlistment posters, recruiting posters. One for the rugby union footballers. British athletes, will you follow the example that most of the rugby players have joined up? The next was out in the colonies, where it says, "The empire needs men. Helped by the young lions, the old lion defies his foes." This was calling for help from the colonies. And this would have appeared in Australia and Canada and New Zealand and places like that. And the last is actually, it's an American one. And it's about financing. And one of the ways that they financed the war was by borrowing money in the form of selling Liberty bonds, which is a kind of investment where you put up money for it, you buy the bond from the government, and a few years later, when the bond does what they call mature, you can return it for the return of your money plus interest on top of that, which is a guaranteed thing. And so it was a way to borrow money. And so this is to beat back the Hun. That was a nickname given to the Germans. And you can see his bloody hands and bayonet, showing how brutal he is and the destruction that he's wrought there. Again, all very subtle stuff. In a total war, like I said, everybody's getting involved, and that includes women in this case. Women will play a critical role during this war. As men leave to fight, women have to take over the jobs that they're leaving behind. They've got to keep these companies going. They've got to keep production going. Again, this is one of those things that's a little bit more famous in World War II, especially in America, where we really get into a total war. We've got Rosie the Riveter and everything, and we'll talk again more about that when we get to World War II. But it's a big deal, and it was a huge deal and very influential on society in not just Europe, but also its effects on American society as well. Women grew food when shortages threatened. Some women even began to join branches of the armed forces really for the first time officially. They sort of set up women's auxiliary units, and they did things like they were drivers, they were nurses, they were did clerical work, the sorts of things that were not combat related, but that could free up male soldiers to go fight in combat while women took care of these less dangerous jobs. As a modern war, a lot of new military technologies are also going to be used for the first time, at least in large numbers, in this war. And we're going to discuss a lot of those. And really, a lot of these are a big part of why this is such a dangerous war. One thing that's going to be improved in this era is the artillery. That's the cannons, the big heavy guns. And they get larger in both the size of the shell that they throw and the range that they can shoot. And what that means is that they can fire from so far away that the soldiers on the receiving end can't do a darn thing about it. Some of these guns, like the railway gun you see down on the lower left, could fire up to 75 miles away. That gun shot at targets like the city of Paris, because by the time it fired and the shell landed, several minutes went past. These shells went so far up that they even had to take into account how far the Earth was going to turn during the flight of the shell. It was very complicated to target that sort of thing. But these huge, massive shells carry a lot of explosive, and they've got new explosives that are even more powerful, and they've got new powder that throws it even farther. And so these guns are just hammering you, and they would use them. They would use them to where for hours and hours, they would just shell these enemy infantry positions. And people went nuts because there was nothing you could do but hide from these. Nothing you could do but hide from this. And you had to seek shelter. If you didn't, you died. It's just that simple. And so they would pound the frontline trenches with this artillery, and you would start your infantry coming across while those shells are still falling. And that's dangerous to your troops too. But a technique that they developed was to do that so that because the enemy knew as soon as those shells stopped falling, your troops were coming. So they would, as soon as the shells stopped falling and they were sure of it, they would run out, get back to their guns, get back in the trenches, what was left of them, and be ready to shoot at you. And you might get caught out in the open and get just all tore up. So what they did was they kept those shells falling until you were almost walking into your own explosions. And in some cases that actually did happen. And that was considered an acceptable loss because the few soldiers that you would lose to your own shells was a lot less than the number of soldiers you would lose if they got caught out in no man's land with machine guns firing at them. The machine gun, actually originally invented by an American named Hiram Maxim. This is the Maxim gun. It was used by both sides, essentially in uh, slightly different configurations, but it's essentially the same gun. It's a matter of fact, it's such a good and effective gun. There are countries in the world that still basically use this same weapon. These are automatic weapons. It means as long as you hold the trigger and it's got bullets in it, it keeps shooting. It is belt fed. And if you look at the picture on the top left, you can see what I mean by that. There's a belt of ammunition that goes into the side of the gun that keeps it fed, and it comes out of these big cans of ammunition. It is water cooled. That big fat thing on the barrel there is a water jacket. You can see, again, in that top left photo, the a can that's going to have water in it, and a hose that goes up to that big fat water jacket. It's like a car's radiator. It helps keep it from overheating. If you look at the bottom left photo, that's the actual size of the barrel itself without that water cooling jacket on it. It's a much smaller barrel. It goes through that big radiator barrel. So it's not shooting bullets as big as that big radiator. It's shooting about a 30 caliber bullet. Most of them were 30 caliber, which means 0.3 inches in diameter. But because they were belt fed, you could keep it continuously loaded. Because it was water cooled, it didn't overheat and then start having mechanical problems. And that meant that you could keep these things shooting literally for hours. And it shot 400 or 500 rounds per minute. You could cut down trees with these things. You could, what it did to a human body is just indescribably bad. And they position these to cover every inch of no man's land as thoroughly as possible. And so anytime you got out of your trenches and started charging across no man's land into the storm of this, one of these guns was as effective as 50 men easily, as far as putting bullets out and shooting at you. And it was just virtually suicide. And yet they did it over and over and over again, and again suffered huge casualties as a result. World War I is going to be the first war in which airplanes are used in a major way. The airplane had only been around for about 10 years at the time, so they were still pretty new, pretty early. Originally, they were used for scouting and weren't armed. The pilots would carry pistols or sometimes rifles or shotguns and sort of pop off rounds at each other as they flew past. But in the early days of the war, really nobody got too injured. They would love to put machine guns on it, and eventually did. But there's a problem up there in the front of the plane. It's the propeller. How do you put machine guns there without shooting off your own propeller? And they tried all sorts of different ideas. One thing they did was put machine guns up on the top wing so that it shot over the propeller, but that's kind of hard to aim and really hard to reload. So that wasn't an ideal solution. One solution was to put metal plating on the back of the propeller so that if a bullet happened to hit the propeller, it would be protected and the bullet would just bounce away. Unfortunately, sometimes that led to bullets coming back towards you or down into your engine, and you could actually shoot yourself down that way. What they really needed, and what the Germans developed first and the Allies later copied from shot down Germans, is a mechanical method that helped to time the machine guns to the spinning of the propeller. It's called an interrupter gear. And when the Germans first developed it, they could then put their machine guns right in front of the pilot, and so he could aim much better. And the number of Allied planes that they shot down went way up. They were way more dangerous at that point. The airplane, the pilots themselves, they fought a totally different war, really, than the foot soldiers in the trenches. Those guys were down there all day, every day for weeks and months. The pilots, they flew from way behind the lines. They lived in fairly comfortable quarters. They weren't living in a trench, for example. They would fly out once or twice a day and spend several hours in the air. And it was dangerous, okay? If they got into combat, their life expectancy was pretty darn short. But as far as their life away from the actual combat, they were far more comfortable. Most of them were officers. Most of them were men of wealth and standing, and so they could afford to live a much more comfortable life. And so they sort of had a different attitude towards the war throughout most of the war. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't see some pretty horrific things and that they didn't have a lot of stress and post-traumatic stress disorder issues, which they would eventually have. They didn't call it that then, but that's what it was. They sort of had a sort of devil-may-care attitude, and that's going to carry on through even today. Fighter pilots, one of their things is that, you know, they're untouchable, unstoppable, bulletproof, etc. Now, as the war progressed, planes are going to get faster and stronger. They can climb faster and turn more tightly, and they'll be better armed and more reliable and all of these things. But really, it took a lot of guts to go up into the air in one of these. I know they look pretty stout, but really that's not the case. That top photo is of a reproduction of a German aircraft known as a Fokker DR-1. DR stands for Dreidecker. It means three-wing. plane. It's a triplane. It's got 3 wings, triplane. And it's painted red in the colors of the most famous of all of the World War I fighter pilots, a fellow by the name of Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron. And here's the Baron himself. Pretty good looking fella, I guess. He was a rock star in Germany, though. Massively famous. They put a lot of propaganda out about him. He's the most effective fighter pilot of the war and one of the best that's really ever been. He shot down at least 80 aircraft during the war. He did not survive the war. He was killed in action on the 21st of April of 1918, towards the end of the war. His brother, who was also a fighter pilot, did survive the war. He was known as the Red Baron because he did come from a minor noble family, and he painted his plane starting in 1917. He started painting his plane solid bright red so that the enemy would know who he was. Why? To get into their heads. If he could cause people to be scared of him, then he was halfway done towards winning the fight. And in Germany, they allowed all the fighter pilots who had a certain number of aerial victories, airplanes shot down, to paint the planes however they wished. One truly new weapon, never before used in war and designed specifically for this one, is going to be the tank. It's a pretty simple idea. We take a vehicle and put a lot of armor on it so that it's bulletproof, put guns and cannons on it, and go towards the enemy. And they can't hurt you, but you can shoot them to bits. And that's the basic idea of it. The British are going to be the first to develop it. That one there at the top is a Mark IV British tank. Is what that's called, and it's probably the most famous of them as far as what they look like. There are unfortunately no actually operable original World War I tanks left. There are some replicas that are in existence, and if you look at the bottom picture, that's a replica of a French tank. It's much smaller than the Mark IV. The Mark IV was huge. It had a crew of 10 people. And the shape was designed so it could cross trenches. That's why it's such a long vehicle. The smaller tank down at the bottom, it's called a Renault FT-17. It was more for support during advances, and it would move up. Now, these things were basically mobile fortresses, and that's how they used them. And the idea was to create a weapon that you could use to break through those enemy trenches. And we talked about trench warfare in the last lecture. And so this was a weapon designed to help you get across no man's land. You could hide behind these as they moved, and they were very slow. The Mark IV went about 3 or 4 miles an hour, top speed. They were mechanically unreliable. They broke down quite a bit, but they were absolutely bulletproof. And the enemy really didn't have cannons located to shoot at them. Cannons had been developed to shoot from farther away. And so they had to come up with solutions to fight them. And one solution was to build tanks of your own. And the Germans would, about a year later, start producing tanks of their own. But yeah, they were developed as breakthrough weapons. When they first showed them the idea to the British government, the army wasn't interested. And the Navy, however, was there. Winston Churchill was there. He had a position known as First Sea Lord. That meant he was the civilian in charge of running the Navy, basically. And he saw them and he loved them. He thought these were the coolest thing. And so he developed the Royal Navy Landship Corps. But they didn't want to call them land ships because that sort of gives away exactly kind of what it is. It's this big armored thing with guns, right? So in any reference that they made to them, they just called them tanks. And that's where they get that name. So that if German spies saw that when they first developed them, that they were going to be shipping 40 tanks from Britain to France, if a German spy saw that telegram or order or whatever, they wouldn't know, at least at first, what that meant. And so that's why they're called tanks. Like I said before, there's no existing operable World War I era tanks. This replica that I took a picture of back in 2014 was at a museum in Britain. They have a big tank museum at a place called in a town called Bovington, and they have these big sort of celebrations a couple times a year, but and exhibits and everything. And so they had built this one for the movie War Horse. And it's pretty accurate, at least on the outside. The inside, it's got modern engines and stuff so that it runs more reliably and everything. But it's pretty cool. You can see kind of how big it is there next to the people. The insides of them were just incredibly loud and stinky and hot and really kind of uncomfortable. I mentioned that in English we call them tanks from the British little subterfuge thing, their little try to trick German spies. When Germans developed them, obviously the word was out about what these things were, and so in typical German fashion, they simply created a new word from lots of other words and crammed them all together into one. And in German, they're known as Panzerkampfwagens, which literally means armored war car, which is exactly what it is. But again, in typical German fashion, nobody wants to say all of that, and so they simply call them panzers. Here's another new weapon being used widespread for the first time ever. If you took my 1301, you know that the very first time that a submarine was used effectively in a war was during the Civil War in America, where the Confederate submarine Hunley attacked a Union ship, the Housatonic, and sank it. And then was immediately sunk afterwards for some reason. They're not sure exactly how it sank. Anyway, submarines have come a good ways in the 50 years in between. Much more reliable, still very dangerous, very fragile, quite slow. They spent most of their time on the surface where they were very vulnerable. They couldn't have, for example, anything really in the way of armor because it made it too heavy and it would sink and not come back up. The Germans used them far more than anybody else. And again, German word, Unterseeboot, literally means undersea boat. And again, they don't call them that, they call them U-boats. But that's what they mean when they say U-boats. And they didn't even name these things. The Germans did not. They just gave them numbers. U-21, U-27, and U-512, and so on and so on. The advantage of the submarine is that it can strike without warning, and they use a weapon known as a torpedo, which is essentially an underwater missile or rocket. And it's got a lot of explosive packed into the end of it, and when it hits an enemy ship under the water line, it blows a great big hole in the bottom of the boat, and that lets lots of water in, and the ship sinks quickly. So they're powerful, but vulnerable. And they have to sneak in, they have to use that stealth in order to survive and be successful. It was a very dangerous kind of thing to do. They were really uncomfortable, and it was a very difficult, tough way to fight a war. World War I is also going to see the first use really in warfare of poisonous gases. This is another attempt at a breakthrough weapon. The idea being if a big cloud of poisonous gas flows over your enemy, they either die or run away, and then they're no longer in those trenches. You follow up wearing your handy dandy gas mask and would be able to break through their trenches, get behind the enemy, and wreck their war effort. It's going to first be used, poison gas is going to first be used by the Germans at the Second Battle of Ypres in April of 1915, so fairly early into the war. There's lots of different gases that they used. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas were the most common. It's really mostly effective as being scary as heck. When these clouds of gas would hit, people just panicked and ran, even after they started to develop countermeasures for it. The first time they used it, they used chlorine. And if any of you have got a swimming pool or ever been around a swimming pool that's been cleaned recently, you know what that smells like. It's got that hard chemical smell. So you can tell it's there, right? Even if you can't see it, chlorine is not a visible gas. Um, but you can certainly smell it. You can feel it stinging your eyes and things, and run away from it. And that's exactly what happened the first time they used it. But the Germans themselves were so scared of it that they didn't follow up very closely, and so it didn't really do for them what they had hoped. Both sides will start using it. Both sides will develop continually improved gases and continually improved countermeasures. Phosgene is another one of the gases they use. It's odorless and colorless. You can't see it, you can't smell it, but it takes a very long time to build up enough to kill you. And so you've got a lot of time to get away from it. By the time you realize that something is wrong, you either are going to die or you've gotten away from it. Mustard gas is actually the nastiest of them. It's a blistering agent. That's its chemical compound there in that molecule, C4H8Cl2S. And it's particularly nasty because it doesn't have to be inhaled to harm you. It's what's called a blistering agent. If it hits moisture, it causes burns. It causes blistering and burning from the chemical reaction wherever it hits moisture. So eyes, nose, throat, lungs, sweat on your skin. Wherever it comes in contact with these things, it's going to cause blistering and a lot of damage. And if you inhaled this stuff, it caused blisters in your lungs, which would burst, and then just ugly way to go. It gets in your eyes and it blinds you. And you see this picture down here at the bottom of a line of soldiers with their eyes bandaged, and they've been gassed. Is what's happened to them, and their eyes are damaged. Some people got their sight back, and some people never did. Okay, this is the last of the technologies we're going to talk about that was developed during this time period. And there's others that we could discuss. Sulfa drugs, which were a sort of contact antibiotic that were being used for the first time, for example. But we're going to talk about helmets here. And this is an old idea that's being brought back. Back in the old days of knights and everything, people had covered their bodies in metal, right, to protect themselves from swords and arrows and things. But people stopped wearing that. The soldiers stopped wearing all of that armor because, quite honestly, a bullet would punch right through it. So it was a bunch of weight that didn't really protect you from your enemy's main weapons anymore. So people quit doing it. But one of the things they discovered fairly early in the war was that a lot of the casualties, particularly in the trenches, that were being caused were head wounds, where somebody's head was just a little bit too high up, and a bullet either clipped it, or when an explosion went off, a little piece of the metal, which is called shrapnel, would catch you in the head. And a head wound is, it's pretty serious, right? I mean, you got things in there you don't want to have pieces of metal jammed through. So one of the things that they came up with, the solution that they came up with, was to get rid of the cloth caps that these soldiers were wearing and give them something a little tougher. And I have images here of two different styles. The one on the left that looks sort of like a bowl turned upside down is that's actually a U.S. Marines one, but it's a copy of what the British wore. And you can see it basically just covers the top of your head, so that when the top of your head is above the edges of the trenches, a glancing shot or a piece of shrapnel that's kind of lightweight and not as dangerous as a bullet would glance off of it. And that's why it's kind of rounded, so it'll kind of slope off bounce off like a pool ball when you're playing pool, would bounce off the bumpers. That's the idea. The Germans used a different design. That's the one on the right. It's more like it covers further down. It covers the ears better and sort of the back of the neck. This one in particular, you can see it's got this big lug thing on the side. That was actually to attach a face mask. They even had face masks that you could attach to this so it would cover the front of your face. Most soldiers never wore that part. In a lot of movies and things, you'll see the Germans have a big spike on the top of their helmet. And they did have helmets like that. They did. But those were for like dress uniforms, really. They didn't wear that spiked thing into combat. It wasn't for like, lowering your head and running at your enemy and spiking him on it. That would be ridiculous, and it would involve you getting your head stuck up next to your enemy. So kind of a bad idea. But anyway, so the solution is to these headwinds was to bring an old idea back, and it works. It saves tens of thousands of lives, honestly. So finally, here we are talking about the U.S. directly being involved in the war. And it's taken us a while to get to this because, well, it took a while for the U.S. to get involved. We don't show up for 3 years into the war, and we'll show up late for World War II as well. So why did we get involved? Well, two big reasons. And one of them that was a real driving force behind it was that unrestricted U-boat warfare that the Germans had been using. If you recall, we talked about them sinking the Lusitania in 1915 and us saying, you better stop that nonsense. And the Germans at the time, being afraid of the U.S. entering the war on the British side, agreed. And then, of course, they resumed it in 1917 because they felt like they really had to. The war was not going well for them, and they needed to choke off the supplies that were getting to Britain. But the final straw that really does it, and this is, honestly, I consider this one of the stupidest things that anybody has ever done, politically, diplomatically speaking, is something known as the Zimmermann Note. And the German foreign minister sent a note to the German ambassador in Mexico, who's named Zimmermann, and it gets intercepted. They send a telegram, and it gets intercepted by the British, and they send it to the United States. And it's absolutely true. This is a true thing. They didn't make this up, although it would have been a brilliant propaganda move if they had. And basically what it says is it says, go to the Mexican government and tell them, promise them, that if Mexico will attack the United States when they declare war on Germany, because they know that the U.S. is going to declare war on Germany. Okay, they see it coming. They've decided that it's inevitable at this point. They say that if Mexico will attack the United States when Germany eventually wins the war, as is, of course, going to happen, at least as far as the Germans are concerned, they will make sure that at the peace treaty, Mexico gets back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Now, this is stupid for a couple of reasons. One, Mexico is not at its best able to take on the United States at this point. Okay, even had Mexico been at its very finest, it was in no way capable of fighting a war against the United States and winning. The second reason it's incredibly stupid is that at the time in 1917, Mexico was in the middle of a decade-long civil war known as the Mexican Revolution, which had started in 1910 and continued until 1920 after World War I was over. They were in no position whatsoever. They had 3 separate armies fighting against each other in Mexico at the time, struggling over who was going to control Mexico. And they send this note to them to try to convince them to attack the United States. Just ridiculously stupid. When that gets published, of course, it causes massive fury in the United States against Germany, huge backlash against the German Empire and their plans. And that's what leads, it's sort of the final straw that leads to us declaring war on Germany. The United States begins a draft in May of 1917, and more than 4 million men will end up serving in one capacity or another. We send over 1 million of them overseas to the Western Front. And the organization that is created to do that is known as the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. It's put under the command of a man named John Pershing, whose nickname is Black Jack Pershing, who was a career officer. He had fought in the Spanish-American War and had come up through the ranks. When he arrives in France, he goes to the grave of the Marquis de Lafayette, who had, as a young man, come and helped America during the American Revolution. Hopefully you remember that from History 1301. And supposedly said, Lafayette, we are here. Basically saying, yeah, we're here to pay back our debt to France for helping us. We're here to help you out. When they get there, as they start to arrive, the French and the British commanders wanted to take small groups of U.S. soldiers and just start plugging them into gaps in their own formations under British and French commanders. And Pershing refuses. He says, nope, we're not doing that. I'm going to wait until I've got enough guys here and recovered and equipped and ready to go. And then instead of going out in little bits, we're going to come down as one big fist and pound the Germans. I refuse to do this until we've built up our strength. I'm not going to let you waste my troops like you've been wasting yours. And he makes that stick. So these are three of the primary military leaders for the Allies during World War I. On the left, you have General John Pershing, who led the AEF. In the center, that's Field Marshal Foch, who is one of the French leaders, along with a fellow by the name of Joffre, both of whom got many of their own men killed because they would not learn from their previous lessons. And on the right is a famous picture of Lord Kitchener, who was he was more of a figurehead for the British Army. The fellow really on the ground running the show for the British was a fellow by the name of Haig, who was pretty much as incompetent as Foch and Kitchener as far as developing better ways to fight. Pershing wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, but he learned from them at least. And he was of the group of leaders, he was probably the best. So besides sending 1 million doughboys, and that was sort of the nickname for American troops in the war, was doughboys, Doughboys. Besides sending 1 million fresh, healthy, well-fed, well-trained, well-equipped doughboys to go smash the Hun, what else did the United States do to contribute to the war? Well, quite a bit, actually. The United States Navy created armed convoys to protect shipping between the United States and their allies in Europe, the French and the British. This severely cuts down on the losses to German U-boats. And so more of the things that we're creating will actually reach the enemy. Now that we are no longer a neutral or even pretending to be neutral, which to be honest, by the time that we get involved, it was mostly a pretense. Now that we're just out in the open on the Allied side, we can send them anything we want. And so United States industries are going to really ramp up to help do that. And they provide weapons and ammunition and medicines and food and clothing and all of the things that both the French and the British military and people need. Remember, they've still got to feed their people back home too, particularly Britain. And most of the men that would be farming For example, in France, they've gone off to fight in the war. Very few Americans, relatively speaking, fought in this war. And so a lot of them stayed home and grew crops. My great-grandfather and grandfather among them. They crop prices actually went up a lot because, and had been for a while, because of the shortages of food in Europe. And so American demand for American food had gone up. And so prices were actually very good. That's going to lead to actually a problem later on in the 20s and 30s. But for the duration of the war, it's actually a very good time to be a farmer in America. The other thing we do is we loaned a whole lot of money to the Allies to help pay for the war. And we'd been doing that since before we got involved. But of course, once we're officially involved, we can do it even more and more openly and in greater amounts. Later on, it will be determined that this is actually one of the driving forces behind the U.S. getting involved on the Allied side. We had loaned so much money, we had extended so much credit to the British and the French that there was a fear that if they lost the war, and really up until 1917 and the Americans showing up, that was a real possibility. Okay, the war didn't really, I mean, it was pretty much a stalemate. Nobody really had enough of an advantage one way or the other until the Americans showed up to tip the scales, really. So it was entirely possible that, particularly with the Russians leaving, that the Germans could have won the war. We couldn't allow that. It would have bankrupted many, many U.S. banks and industries, companies that had made the guns and things to sell to them. So later on, we're going to have a committee called the Nye Committee, and we'll talk about them more later, who investigates the causes of U.S. involvement, and they say that was a big one, and that's going to affect how we act in the 30s leading up into World War II. Okay, so the United States shows up and saves the day, and we actually crow about that a lot. It's very irritating, by the way, to the British and the French when we say things like that, because even though it's partially true that we tilted the scales, we didn't suffer anything like what they did. Okay, they suffered so much from World War One, and our losses were relatively so light. It was, ridiculous. We can't say that we won the war. We wouldn't have all by ourselves. What we can say is that our contributions tilted the scale in favor of the Allies. And that's going to be true for World War II as well. A lot of what we say about World War I is at least to a degree, applicable to World War II. This is why I will refer to World War II sometimes as World War I Part 2. It's just a continuation. It's a sequel. The seeds of World War II are being sown right here. So the cost of the war. Nobody's entirely sure exactly how many people died. At least 8.5 million, possibly as much as 11, died directly. Twice that number are wounded. So all told, 30 million casualties. And by wounded, I'm talking about people who lost limbs, were blinded for life, or deafened for life, things like that, seriously wounded. The United States loses 116,708 men. And we know exactly how many because we're very good at keeping track of records. The reason we don't know, for example, how many died in the total war is because not all the countries were good at keeping records. The Russians, for example, were horrifically bad about it. So were the Italians, so were the Turks. Austro-Hungarians are a little bit better. The Japanese, they're terrible about it because they simply don't care about how many enemies they killed. Money-wise, it cost $185 billion in 1914 dollars, in early 20th century dollars. So you can at least add a couple of zeros. We're talking trillions of dollars. This is an incredible sum of money. Huge areas of land are laid waste by the fighting, particularly in Belgium and Western Belgium and Eastern France. There are still parts of France called zones rouges, red zones, that you're not allowed to go into without very special permission. There were gases used that made places uninhabitable for decades. There's so much explosives in there that it's actually dangerous that they have random explosions in places. And so some villages are just totally shut down, and they can't even live there even 100 years later. So yeah, I mean, the devastation is massive. People psychologically, they become disillusioned with both their political and military leadership. There will be revolutions in Germany and Austro-Hungary, for example, and Russia, obviously. Russia collapses into a civil war. The Central Powers, as a result of this war, will have all of their empires taken away by the winners. It's a massively expensive thing in terms of human lives, money, damage to the world, and political fallout. So these are the big four leaders of the Allied powers in World War I: France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Italy. And they gather in Paris in January of 1919, just a couple of months after the fighting has come to an end. The armies are still out in the field. They're kind of keeping an eye on each other, but there's no actual fighting going on since the armistice on November 11th, 1918. And they come together to write a treaty, the formal treaty for peace. And so it's called the Paris Peace Conference. Germany and the other Central Powers were not invited to send delegates. They were going to be told they lose, and the winners are going to tell you how things are going to be. And so it's an imposed treaty. And of course, that's going to leave some sour feelings. Now, each of the big four leaders has their own agenda when they come to the peace treaty conference in Paris. The treaty itself will be signed in Versailles, the French royal palace outside of Paris. But Woodrow Wilson is the president of the United States, and he personally goes to represent the United States. This is very unusual. People, up until this time, presidents did not leave the United States while they were president. It was sort of unheard of. And a lot of that had to do with difficulty of communications and things. It was considered difficult for them to run the country if they were overseas, which is probably true. So Wilson shows up and he has a plan, and his plan has 14 points, and so it's called the 14 points. And basically what he wants to do is he wants to avoid another war. He wants to avoid another war. And so his 14 points are aimed at defusing the causes of the war, creating a League of Nations. One of his really important things he wanted to do was to create this League of Nations, an organization where delegates from the various countries could come together and peacefully work out their differences. And he pushes for self-determination. That means he wants the people of Europe to determine for themselves who will be their rulers and what form their government will take, so that we don't see, for example, issues like Serbian nationalists killing the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and causing a war. But the problem is the other three leaders have their own agendas, and they're not interested in his peace without victory idea. They won, and it's time for them to cash in. Here are the 14 points. And again, it's to avoid another war. Open diplomacy, no more secret treaties. Freedom of the seas, let people trade with who they want to. Reduction of armaments. If we make our armies smaller, we'll be less likely to just go and use them. Get out of Russia so that Russia doesn't have an issue with fighting us. Preserve Belgium. That was what got the British into the war, for example. Restoration of French territory. We're going to redraw those lines that were drawn back in 1870 that took territory away from the French and gave it to Germany. We're going to take it away from Germany and give it back to the French. Break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, redraw the Balkan boundaries so that, for example, Serbia is all the Serbians in one place. Create an independent Poland, which creates a buffer state between Russia and Germany. Everybody knows the Russians and the Germans don't like each other. The Poles would like to be free again. And so they say, okay, well, let's solve that by creating an independent Poland here in the middle. And last but not least, as far as Wilson was concerned, was the creation of that League of Nations. This is David Lloyd George, a Welshman who was the British Prime Minister at the end of the war. During the peace talks, his agenda is territorial concessions. Now, I don't want to call them colonies because that has sort of a negative connotation. What he calls them is mandates, and it's exactly the same thing as a colony. It just sounds a little bit better. And where he's looking is the Middle East. And why the Middle East? Oil. And so he puts the needs of his nation first. He's trying to get these colonies. The new colonies full of oil will help to pay off all of Britain's debts. And that's what he's really interested in. This is Georges Clemenceau. He's the Prime Minister of France, the premier in France. His goal is to punish Germany. He wants to cripple them, partly for revenge for the Franco-Prussian War, partly in revenge for this war. This war has been incredibly costly in terms of lives and money, especially for France, where most of it was fought. He wants massive reparations. He wants Germany to pay the bill. And he's gonna get those, and it's gonna help bankrupt Germany and help set the stage for World War II. He also demands that Germany be disarmed. He says they can have no warplanes, no submarines, no tanks, no heavy water-cooled machine guns like they had been using, no big warships, no conscription. They can't have a big body of trained soldiers anymore. No poison gases, none of it. They can have none of these modern warfare things. He says you can only have a small army, and you've got to sign up for it. If you're going to sign up for it, you've got to stay in it for 20 years. Huge enlistment periods, which reduces the size of the pool of trained men. This is going to backfire as well. All of these things will be discarded, and we'll talk about it more when we start talking about World War II. But all of these things are going to backfire in the long run. But he gets them right now, and they punish and humiliate Germany as a result of this. And this is Vittorio Orlando, the Italian Prime Minister, again putting the needs of his nation first during the talks. He wants territory from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's mainly what he wants. Unfortunately for him, the others essentially ignore him. Resentment about this, about their territorial demands, and the lack of assistance in paying off their war debts and things are going to severely feed into Italian resentment towards the Allies, which is going to help the fascists gain power in Italy in the 1920s, again helping to lead into World War II. So the peace treaty will finally be signed in a railroad car at Versailles in 1919. And the French government will actually turn this railroad car into something of a museum piece for many years. The treaty is humiliating to Germany. It dismantles their empire. It wrecks their economy. It's really helping to set up World War II. The treaty goes back to the United States to be ratified, and the U.S. Senate rejects it. The U.S. Senate at this point is dominated by Republicans. Wilson is a Democrat, and they basically say, no, we want no part of this. We want to go back to the good old days of isolationism, where we didn't interfere in other countries' affairs, and we didn't lose over 100,000 good American boys' lives and spend all of this money. And so they reject the treaty. They reject the League of Nations. And Wilson, he tries his best to convince people to support it. The effort to do so actually breaks him. He probably has a stroke. His health is very bad the last few months of his presidency. It's entirely possible that he actually wasn't running the country and should have been given over to his vice president. But they hid that for the last few months of his presidency. He doesn't run for re-election in 1920. And it will be the Treaty of Berlin of 1921 that will officially end the war between the United States and Germany. So we end up signing a separate peace. And that's going to be it for discussion of World War I. I know it's been long and detailed, but it's a really, in the terms of how it affects the world, it's just an incredibly important period. Every bit as important as World War II, which I hope you have figured out, sets the stage for. And we'll eventually get to ourselves. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye.